Welcome to Manifested Publishers.
Welcome to our today's history and government lesson. Your teacher, Conan Gakure. It's my pleasure to have you in today's lesson. We are going to introduce a new topic, that is the establishment of colonial rule in Kenya. That is the next topic of Form 3 that we are going to be discussing. In this unit, we are going to delve more into the Kenyan, the establishment of colonial rule in Kenya. In the previous topic that you have studied, we were learning about the European invasion and the process of colonization of Africa. We discussed how the European powers scrambled, were fighting, were competing against each other, right? That is the scramble, the sudden rush. So the European powers rushed into getting colonies or territories in the African continent. That is what we defined as the scramble for Africa. And then after the scramble, they sat down during the Berlin Conference, if you can remember, that was held in which year? I'll give you that. You should be able to know the year in which the Berlin Conference was held, that was led by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of the German Republic then. So they came down and sat and decided to subdivide, partition, share in an organized manner. That is partition. So they partitioned Africa amongst themselves. That is the partitioning of Africa. So Africa was now subdivided as a continent. It was subdivided. Each European power took part of the continent for themselves. The European powers that were struggling or that shared the African continent, that they refer to as the African cake, right? Can you remember which are these powers? Can you mention them? The powers that subdivided or took territories in Africa, the European powers. Which are they? British, very good. We have the French, very good. We have which other? We have the Italians, we have the Germans, we have the Belgians, right? These are some of the powers. We had Portugal, some of the European powers that came to get colonies. Are you able to remember the reasons that we gave? Why were they so much interested in getting these colonies and getting each and every person getting a portion of the African continent? There were so many reasons that we gave. We divided them into social, into economic, political, human, and then the strategic reasons for them scrambling and partitioning Africa. And we are not going to dwell in that because we have already tackled that. So based on that, now we come down into and look at now how the Kenyan territory was colonized. And the first thing to mention, it was colonized by the British. The British took control of the Kenyan colony. But before that, I would want to give you a background of how they ended up coming to take position of Africa. So, of Kenya, sorry. Kenya is part of the East Africa. Kenya is part of East Africa. In East Africa, we have other nations. At that time, we have Tanzania, we have Uganda, we have Ethiopia, right? The eastern part of Africa. So there were different powers that were interested in getting the East African territory. Some of these countries are Germans. Germany was one of them. We had Britain. We had Italy. Right? We had Italy that were competing to get the East African territory. We also had the Portuguese, who had come earlier than these powers. Remember in your Form 1 work, the contacts between East Africa and the outside world. So East Africa had been exposed to the outside world through trade. That was the main thing that exposed the East African coast to this power. So by the trade, it attracted these powers to come and get colonies in East Africa because of the trade. People were able to know that East Africa is rich, and now these powers came and competed to get a portion of the East African part of the African continent. So these are the countries that were fighting. So they had, after the Berlin Conference, they had to divide the East African continent amongst themselves. They made a protectorate, and I'm sure you discussed that. You know what a protectorate is: a sphere of influence where power has been put in place. So Britain took control of Kenya, which is the land where we are living in. The boundaries of Kenya, we were colonized by Britain. So you ask yourself, what are the factors or what are the reasons why the British were so much interested in taking Kenya as their colony in East Africa? Because remember, they were competing with all these other nations. So there must be a significant reason or reasons why these powers are fighting or struggling to get each other, or struggling against each other to get part of the colony of Africa. So that is what we are going to be discussing. Let us start with that at that point so that we are able to go forward. So the factors, you can also refer to that as reasons for factors for colonization. Factors for colonization of colonization stroke occupation. Stroke occupation of Kenya. Remember, we are saying, and I've mentioned that it was occupied by Britain. So what are these factors that encouraged or made it necessary for the British to come and occupy Kenya? The first one was the source of the Nile. The source of the Nile. Remember, the Nile starts in Uganda, right? And we said it was very essential because Britain had occupied Egypt. So it was necessary for them to secure where the Nile starts because Egypt is a desert. They do not have their own sources of water. They heavily relied on the Nile as a source of water. It provided, the Nile provided water. It also provided silt. Silt that could be deposited on the shores of the Nile towards as it goes to drain into the Mediterranean Sea. So it carries along the top soil from the highlands, from the East African highlands, the Ethiopian highlands. So it was very essential for the British to occupy Kenya and Uganda being one, at that time the British protectorate, so that they are able to protect the source of river Nile. Why? Because they had occupied Egypt, and as we discussed in our previous topic, Egypt was very strategic, or was very important to them because of the Suez Canal. So it was necessary for the British to come and occupy Kenya so that they could safeguard those interests, the source of river Nile. That is the first reason why they were very interested in occupying Kenya. Number two, Kenya had strategic interests, or the strategic position of Kenya on the coast, on the East African coast. So British had interest in India, right? They had interest in India. They had colonized India, and it was very rich for them. It was very essential. So Kenya was a strategic stopover position. It was a calling place for the British as they moved towards India. So they had to colonize Kenya so that they can safeguard their interests in India. They could easily move from Kenya to India in case there was need. So Kenya was of strategic importance to them. Remember, Kenya had very good natural harbors. So the British would come, dock at the coast, and take time as they move towards the Indian place. And then number three, they were searching for raw materials. They were searching for raw materials. Remember, it was during the time of industrialization. There were a lot of industries that had developed in Britain. Britain had become a superior power. Actually, it was the first country to power to industrialize. Remember in your topic in development of industry, Britain was the first to industrialize. So it had a lot of industries that required a lot of raw materials. Examples is what we have: cotton, there is tea, right? They could come and get these plantations and get these minerals and then export them or take them to Britain for the industries to produce. And then after they had processed the raw materials that have come from Kenya, they had also to look for market. So Kenya also provided a ready market. That was another reason or factor for the colonization or occupation of Kenya. So the British came because Kenyans provided a ready market for the goods. Kenyans, we were producing these raw materials, but we did not have our own industries to produce the clothing, to produce the shoes. So the British occupied Kenya in the interest that they could be able to get market for their products in exchange of the raw materials that they were producing, and also Kenyans were also willing to make payments for those goods. Let us look also at the other reasons why the British had to occupy Kenya. Number 5. They wanted to protect missionaries. So during the 19th century, there were Christian missionaries who came to evangelize. They came to spread the gospel, right? They came to spread the gospel. So these missionaries requested their mother countries or their home governments for protection. So they require to be protected. So they came and asked the home governments to provide them with support or to provide them with protection. Apart from the missionaries, there were also other people who had come to invest in in Kenya. So they also required protection. Apart from protection, number 6, they also wanted to abolish slave trade. So the British came with the interest of abolishing slave trade that was happening at the coast, led by the Portuguese initially, and then we also had the Arabs. Remember, Said had established a plantation at the coast, which required a lot of manpower. So there was development of slave trade. So the British came in the interest of abolishing slave trade and in its part establish legitimate trade. So they wanted to promote legitimate trade. That is, the market, they wanted to find a place where they could sell their own, they could sell their own products. So apart from that also, number 7, they had another reason for coming to the east or to Kenya. They wanted to invest the surplus capital. So from the industries that they had developed in their homes, they had a lot of capital. They got a lot of profits from the industries. So these profits, they needed to invest it somewhere else, because now they have industries that are providing a lot of resources to them. So there existed a class of wealthy merchants, right? There are wealthy merchants or traders, wealthy merchants who wanted to advance or get or invest the monies they had gotten in new lands. So they had to come and occupy the Kenyan territory for them to continue enjoying the profits. And then apart from that, there was need, or there was prestige. It was prestigious for them to acquire the Kenyan colony. It added to their interest. It added to their self-esteem that they have a new colony. And then the second last reason why they came to the or occupy, or they wanted to colonize the African or the Kenyan territory, was to settle the surplus population. To settle the surplus population with production of more food from the industries. The population in Britain had increased. So they needed a place where they could settle the British community. And Kenya was a perfect place. We have a very good climate. That is the first thing. And we have very fertile land. So these Europeans had the opinion that they could come and settle in the Kenyan highlands. That is why they went to the highlands. In the highlands, at the coast, we had very nice beaches where they could relax themselves. They could swim. Right? In Nairobi, we had very fresh water that they could be able to access every now and then. And then lastly, the independence. The independence of the USA. The independence of the USA. USA was a colony of Britain. So when USA became independent, the British turned to Africa, and specifically Kenya, based on the other points that I've put forward. So they wanted to get other colonies to compensate for the loss they had gotten after the independence of the USA. So these are some of the factors that necessitated or encouraged the British to come and make an occupation of Africa. So I'm sure you are able to discuss them in detail, and as we have done, and you are able to group them into economic, social, and political reasons. And I'm sure when you are asked to mention political reasons, you are able. For example, when you are told to mention even the economic reasons, you are well able, because you just talk of ready market, you'll talk of raw materials, right? You'll talk of the investment of capital, right? So those are economic. Social, you talk of missionaries and traders. You talk of when you talk of social, there is missionaries, right? And also abolishment of slave trade. That is humanitarian aspect. Political, you talk of prestige, right? You talk of the independence of the USA, right? You talk of the strategic interests of Kenya. Those are part of the politics or dealing with ruling, right? So those are the factors. So as we have introduced our lesson, our topic, so we shall in the coming lessons look at what or how did they occupy the Kenyan territory. How did the Kenyan people react towards the coming of the British, and then how did they rule the Kenyan territory? So those are the issues we are going to be discussing in our coming lessons. So allow me now to give you, as we end our first lesson, allow me to give you a revision question. A revision question for you. Actually, let me give you two questions, revision questions. Number one, identify the European powers competing for East Africa. And then number two, discuss the factors that encourage the British occupation of Kenya. Number one, identify the European powers that competed for East Africa. And then number two, discuss the factors that encourage the British occupation of Kenya. So those are the questions that I want you to attempt. And with that, we have come to the end of our history and government lesson for today. Thank you for your participation and for watching. Until the next time, bye-bye.